everybody. Hi, Justine. Hi, Nina. Hi, James. Great to see you all. We'll just leave it a few minutes to let other people join the webinar. We just try and start at 11 o'clock. Hi, David. Good to see you today. I think we're still waiting for other people to join. Hi, Andrew from Newcastle. Good to see you. Hi, Catherine from Wirral. Pleased that you were able to join. That's great. So I think that should be it. If we aim to just kick off at 2 minutes past, just to give a couple of other people just a minute to log in as well. Hi, Catherine. So I think we'll kick off, shall we? Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. Thanks very much for joining. As a form of introduction, I'm Karen Meller. I'm sector lead for local authorities here at Voicescape. For those people who don't know Voicescape, we use data science, behavioural insights and digital technology to create a positive residential engagement. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this session with you today. We've got some great presentations from both Stephen Johnson, behavioural insight consultant, and also Mark Summons, support service manager within revenues and benefits at Middlesbrough Council. So two industry leaders who I'm sure will help you to resolve challenges that perhaps you're faced with or your departments are faced with. But before I start, I thought I'd kick off with some housekeeping. The webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes, so my aim is to keep it to 45 minutes and to keep to that timetable. We do have a Q&A session planned for at the end of the presentations. If you do have any questions, if you just ask the questions using the chat box on the right-hand side. There is a question box there, so if you could use that, it'll make it easier for ourselves to identify those questions. If we do run over time today, what I will do, I'll go through all the questions and then I'll put them in a document with the answers, and then we'll circulate them around across to you later on today. But of course, if you do need to leave the session early, the session will be recorded and we'll send everybody a link. So please feel free to share that link with people that may not have been able to attend today or with any other colleagues. We all know that collecting tax and rates has never been the easiest job. And now we have additional challenges with the impact of COVID-19. We're under additional pressure to find new ways of working, as well as finding a balance of an ethical and an effective approach to collect. So I thought it'd be really interesting to share this slide with you. And it's based on research that we've done in-house at Voicescape. So what we've done our own analysis of government data that actually shows some key differences between the council tax collection for the last financial 2 years. And what it does, it gives you an indication of the impact that COVID has had on collection rates. But these are national rates. So the figures on top are the figures for the last financial year, so 2020, 2021. The figures at the bottom gives you an average increase per council. So as you can see, the total arrears is £4.4 billion, which shows an increase of an incredible 24% over the previous year. But this is just a snippet of the reports that we've written. So if you'd like me to share the full report with you, just drop me a note in the chat box. But based on those figures, as councils, we need to collect the money. But we also need to take the consideration, and we need to take into consideration the new pressures that our residents are under. So now I'm going to pass you across to Stephen.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Johnson. I'm a behavioural insights consultant, and my work focuses on how the application of behavioural science can help drive positive change, both within organisations, but also within the communities that those organisations serve. I've been working with local authorities and social housing providers for over a decade now, all focused on how we can use behavioural science to drive innovation around a range of different contexts. So digital adoption, property access, resident participation, but the majority of that work actually took place within an income recovery and debt recovery context. So highly relevant for today, hopefully. But for today, I'm going to be focusing more specifically on the role of voice in a digital future. So the particular role that a human touch and more specifically voice communication will play in council performance as we accelerate on our digital journeys. And now the context for this presentation is squarely local authority, not only just because most of my work has been undertaken with local authorities and social housing providers, but also, it also speaks directly to the key challenges that the sector is facing, and that's the increased pressure of more demand needing to be responded to with less resource, a perennial challenge I appreciate, but one that has intensified more so recently as we feel the need to recover better, build back better, etc., and respond to the pandemic challenge. So ultimately, we need to find new ways of working to respond to this challenge. So when it comes to engaging with our customers, communicating with our residents, it's no surprise that we've seen a surge towards digital and automated communications. Digital first, digital by default, they're all mainstays now of strategy and communication within local government. And of course, this is more than a trend within just local government. The world itself is hurtling deeper into its digital future, a future in which screen-based, text-driven communication is simply more cheaper, more convenient, more trackable, more analyzable, more predictable. So we can see that the sheer volume of screen-based, text-driven communication is increasing massively. So a recent study here, 75% of people would rather text than talk on their phone. 72% text more than 10 times per day, and 31% are sending more than 50 times, more than 50 messages a day. But that isn't just driven by organizations seeking efficiencies, that's also being pulled by an emerging generation of customers who seem to prefer text-based communication for a whole host of reasons. So from a behavioural perspective, there are a range of interesting factors at play that are driving customer preference for text-based communication. And from my perspective, this becomes interesting because they're deeply rooted in individual psychology and group culture. So compared with written communications, text communications can be consumed at a pace and a time to suit the individual. So you have much more choice and control over how you consume that message. Vital, very important psychological considerations, choice, control, autonomy, etc. But for some, it's a simple matter of manners. Many are starting to see a live voice call as a form of interruption, and for some, an interruption that borders on rude. So some general kind of social convention around the appropriateness of live voice calls for some people. For others, there's actually an anxiety trigger in a voice call. So fear of the unknown, they don't know who's calling and they don't know what the nature of that message is. There's an uncertainty of the content and people feel under pressure for having to respond in the moment. But for me, as a behavioural insights consultant concerned with the science of human behaviour and what makes people tick, there's two key questions that emerge from this trend. Firstly, is the customer's preferred communication channel the most effective? So does it deliver the right outcomes? It might be the channel that the customer is requesting, but does it work for the organisation and the customer? Is it driving the right outcomes? And secondly, what might it be that we are losing in the screen-based communication? What unintended consequences might we end up triggering as we actively reduce human contact? So fundamentally, it's a question as if we become more digital, do we become less human? And if so, what impact might that be having on the relationships we have with our residents and their subsequent behaviours? So let's just sidestep a second to consider the council-resident relationship from a behavioural science point of view, and we can start to build up the picture of how the unique role of voice could add value within this context. So what we've learned over recent years, both in the wider literature, but also in my own research, talking with hundreds of council and tenants and social residents, is a range of things. First of all, we found that the quality of the council-resident relationship is linked to the likelihood that a resident will engage. So in very basic terms, the more positive that relationship is, the more likely the resident will be to engage when communication is sent out. Also, the quality of that council-resident relationship is largely determined by trust, and that applies especially amongst our more vulnerable communities who may be struggling with mental health difficulties, severe indebtedness, etc. I'm sure you're aware, many of the things that we will be dealing with within a Revs and Bens context. And finally, if trust is one of the key components of that good relationship, we're starting to see quite clearly how trust is heavily influenced by communication. Now, we can break trust down in many different ways, but what we continue to see is communication as a key driver of trust. So how we communicate, the channel we use, when we communicate, the timing of that channel, and what we communicate. So not just the information, but the tone, the wording of the messages, etc., all have a direct influence on trust and subsequently impacting the customer, the resident relationship. So when we start to apply this behavioural lens, so we're thinking about how relationships we build with our residents and our residents interact with us, we can start investing in this relationship as a driver of efficiencies. Because if residents are more likely to engage with us, if they trust us, then they're more likely to get support, more likely to pay on time, more likely to need less intervention, and this all reduces the amount of demand and the amount of resource required to serve those residents. So it becomes a kind of a hard and fast driver of efficiencies, the resident relationship, rather than just a customer satisfaction metric, so to speak. So obviously this raises the question, how do we go about building the trust? And this is where the power of voice could come into its own. We saw earlier that communication is one of the key drivers of trust. So what we've found now through a wide range of research is that fundamentally trust needs touch, not physical touch necessarily, but a human touch. So a meta-analysis of studies showed that overall face-to-face contact builds most trust, but that is closely followed by phone and voice. Text message comes in next, but that's only the case if the text message is bi-directional and in real time. So you're getting a sense that you're speaking to a real human being, interacting with a real human being. Of those channels, and text covers standard SMS, but it also covers kind of WhatsApp and other kind of messaging platforms as well. Email out of the suite comes off worst, apparently because it lacks that instant response. You know, you don't get that sense that you're dealing in real time with another human being. And the text message generally goes the same way in terms of effectiveness in building trust if it's not, doesn't feel like a real-time conversation. Interestingly, when the communication was received via video, the rankings of these human qualities and the ranking of trust didn't increase any further, even though you had access to visual cues and body language, etc. It didn't increase any further than just the voice call, suggesting that it could be that voice has some unique capacity to be conveying the sense that there is another human being that you're communicating with. So obviously this is all talking on average. Depending on context, there's some interactions and some customers would be better served with a text message in certain situations, an email, a chatbot, or who knows, even a letter. There are those customers for whom still a letter would be optimum in some sense. But the key challenge is aligning the communication method with the needs of that customer in the context of the resource that we have available. We can't be doing face-to-face visits with everyone, and ideally we wouldn't need to be sending expensive letters to everyone either. So what could it be about voice that has a unique ability, that superpower, so to speak, when it comes to building trust? So this is where some of the deeper behavioural science comes in. So the research shows that at a basic level, people just simply understand human communication better than information that they receive on a digital screen. So in a range of studies, people who listened to information tended to score much higher on recall and comprehension tests that were subsequently conducted. It's also been found, again, that voice communication also seems to inspire more respect and confidence than text. So in another study that was an experimental situation set up to simulate a recruitment situation, job recruitment, candidates who submitted a voice version of their kind of cover letter that went with the CV were judged to be more intelligent, more thoughtful, more rational, generally ranked higher compared with those who'd submitted the identical letter in a written form. The only difference was the form. The actual letter was exactly the same. The only difference was one was voice and one was letter. But the real clincher, and I think this is especially the case within the context of debt recovery, is the ability of voice to create an emotional connection. So think about some of the situations in which residents are needing to interact with their council. Think about some of the situations that we're seeking to collect income and recover debt within. The sensitive situations, personal situations, often high stakes situations, situations in which emotional content and connection becomes essential, or at least critical for a good outcome. So to get a bit more technical on the behavioural science side of things, there are a number of psychological principles that have been shown to underlie this key emotional connection. Humanization being one. So the feeling that you're speaking to a fellow human being has a massive impact on the quality of the conversation and the impact and the kind of the resultant outcome. So compared to voice communication, text has been shown to essentially dehumanize the messenger. And there are all sorts of behavioural implications to this. So those sorts of communications, without that sense that you're dealing with a real human being, they've been shown to be easier to ignore. They're less likely to stimulate trust. And fundamentally, from a behavioural point of view, you feel less likely to, less obliged to respond. So you'll be less likely to carry out the behaviour that would be optimum after the communication. So the more the human the interaction feels, the more likely the desired behaviour will follow. There's almost a kind of a moral imperative at play there, because you're dealing with another human being and not just a screen and a machine. So the science also points towards a factor known as empathic accuracy. So studies have shown that people are more able to accurately interpret the thoughts and feelings and emotions, the internal states of the people they're communicating with, compared with text. So again, thinking about the complex situations and life circumstances that we're dealing with when we're recovering debt, that understanding of the emotions that are in play, what's going on in terms of the internal states of the customers and residents we're dealing with becomes crucial to gaining a positive outcome. But there's also some evidence about how the neurons in our brains actually fire differently between the two communication methods. So when we're receiving and reading a text message compared to when we're having a voice conversation with a real human being. So neural mirroring refers to how when two people talk to each other over the phone, the neural activity in areas of their brain is actually actively mirroring each other. So the same parts of the brain are firing across the two different people involved in the conversation. So that's been taken as suggesting that the listener is in some way actually feeling similar emotions to the speaker as they work through their conversation. So obviously, in terms of empathy and understanding, some of these softer skills that are required to create sustainable resolution within a debt recovery situation are a conversation, and the role of voice seems to be key to that sort of nuance. So the implications of this for customer experience, customer relationships, and in this context, income collection and debt recovery are clear. So we need to build trust, and trust needs touch. So having worked with a range of local authorities on digital adoption, I'm starting to see most now to see that the drive towards efficiency through digital technology in terms of how we communicate with residents does need a counterbalance of human touch. We need to identify those interactions or those customers for whom a human touch is necessary to the relationship and the desired outcome. Now, that doesn't mean we have to have a conversation with every single customer. Obviously, that won't be practical. But what it does mean is we need to find ways of identifying those customers, those cases for where trust is an issue, where relationship is important, and we prioritize resource towards securing a voice conversation with those customers. Other interactions can be handled in an automated text-based way. Nobody gets left out, but we're optimizing the kind of allocation of resource to get the desired outcome through the selective use of voice. So then this starts to bring front and center how voice communication could represent that sweet spot between technology and humanity. We need the technology to drive efficiency, but we need to retain an element of humanity to maintain trust, to build and maintain trust, which ultimately drives some of the more complicated desired outcomes. Because in an ideal world, we'd conduct face-to-face visits with all our residents, because the research has shown, that's the key, the most effective way of building trust and improving relationships. But in the real world, obviously that isn't going to be practical. There's just not enough resource available to be doing face-to-face visits with everyone. So this is where the potential of voice comes in. It preserves that human touch that we need to build trust, but its deployment can be made as efficient as possible using the power of technology. And for me, this will represent the unique role of voice in our digital future. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope that was of interest, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Stephen, thanks very much for that very insightful presentation. And what was really interesting is the fact that you highlighted that despite the wonders of digital technology, what it gives us and the advantages it offers us, that human touch, that conversation between two people is still so powerful. And I know certainly from speaking to a lot of our customers, it's getting tougher and tougher to collect revenue in this modern economic climate. And we need to use our resource a lot better. We work with local authorities to drive engagements, to collect revenue. And as I'm sure you'll agree with me, the hardest part is actually connecting with those people, to be able to have those direct conversations. It's time consuming for your officers. And as what Stephen says, if we can harness technology to drive efficiencies, to free up those people's time so they can have a focus on those human interactions, that is what is actually needed to build that trust. And that's exactly what we do with Voicescape Collection. It helps you to directly engage with the customers, to collect that revenue in a way that supports the community, and as well as drive cash revenue. Voicescape Collection automates all those inefficiencies by reaching out to customers to ask them to contact the council. And that's by using text and the power of voice to drive that inbound arrears focused conversation with the departments. So that leaves your officers to do what they're trained and what they're good at doing, and that's to have that conversation with the customer, understanding their circumstances, why they haven't paid the bill, and getting them to pay, or where necessary, negotiating a financial plan. And actually, I'm sure you won't be surprised what the impact it has on staff mental health and well-being. So now I'm going to pass across to Mark Simmons from Middlesbrough Council. They've used the system for about 8 months now. And Mark's going to talk to you how they use Voicescape collections and how it's changed the way they work within the department. And also touch on what impact it has had on the department and how it's increased their collections. So thank you for joining, Mark. Across to you.
Thanks, Karen. My name is Mark Simmons and I'm the Support Services Manager at Middlesbrough Council. I manage a team of technical experts and service development and change staff within the Revenues and Benefits Service. I have 35 years experience in Revs and Bens, working from a filing clerk right up to a benefits manager, and now I'm in a change management project management environment, which is a legacy from when the service was outsourced to the private sector. A little bit of background about Middlesbrough. It's quite a deprived area. It's in the top 10 of deprivation generally across many of the indices which govern deprivation. We're one of the local authorities with the highest proportion of neighbourhoods among the most deprived in England, and this has been largely unchanged since 2015. And we rank as one of the most deprived districts regarding income deprivation among children. And for council tax collection, it's really difficult in any year. Collection rates have fallen year on year for most of the last 10 years, with working age council tax collection falling from 91% in 2013 to 14, right the way down to 72% in 2019-20. So the challenge that we were faced with, aside from our year-on-year collection difficulties, when we hit the COVID lockdown in March, April 2020, we were presented with a unique problem, which really could be explained as follows. We have around about 63,000 properties charge payers in Middlesbrough, and 18,000 of them get some kind of council tax reduction. Our net collectible debt, 75 million, and overall our collection rate is 92%. Most people in Middlesbrough have a minimum payment of 15% of council tax, so we're collecting something from everybody. In our last normal year, 2019-20, we got charging orders of around 13,000 of our charge payers who had fallen into arrears and proceeded to summons stroke liability order. Now, COVID meant that the courts were going to be closed and we had nowhere really to go with those charge payers who had defaulted on their council tax. Although courts did go virtual in November 2021, Middlesbrough were one of the first ones to trial it in the Teesside area. We actually only secured 3,000 liability orders during that year. So that was 25% of what we would expect. So it really was going to be a challenge for us because we had lots of people who were going to proceed to court, but really we didn't have a court to actually hear those cases and move us on in the enforcement process. Now, we had tried outbound calling those customers. We'd put on an evening shift between 5 and 7, and we only had a 5% success rate. Now, part of that problem was our council phone number was showing as withheld on people's phones. But part of it is just it was very difficult to get people to engage with us. We'd also tried texting people. We only had a 3.7% success rate from our texts. And our staff, really, they can collect if they get the customer on the phone. I mean, just by example, for business rates, which is obviously a different type of tax, we collect 98 to 99% of our business rates year on year. So really, what our staff were saying to us is just get the customer on the phone and we'll be able to collect from them. So the challenge for us in May 2020 was that, what do we do to try and collect from defaulters when they have no legal enforcement at the back end of the collection process? How are we going to actually go about collecting from them? So this is where we really lead into our relationship with Voicescape. So around May of 2020, our biggest landlord in Teesside, which is a landlord called 13 Group, they have around 15,000 properties in the Middlesbrough area, which is about 20 to 25% of our council tax base. They were using software to engage with their tenants who had rent arrears. We got in touch with them. We had a demo of the software, which was Voicescape software that we're talking about today. And we were absolutely amazed to see that they were achieving 69% connection rates during May 2020, which is obviously the early days of the pandemic. Now, for us, anywhere near 69% connection rates would be an absolute dream, bearing in mind we'd tried an evening shift and got 5%, and we tried checks and got 3.7%. Even half of that would be fabulous. So we engage with Voicescape. For us, we're a revs and bends function. Voicescape weren't in the revs and bends field. So it was coming to us unproven in our area. It was coming from a rent arrears background, who obviously where someone's in rent arrears, the consequence of not paying is that they lose their property. We don't have that consequence. But what Voicescape had proven is that they could engage with Teesside tenants. So many of them owed us council tax. So our own tenants were actually using the Voicescape product and actually connecting with 13. So why wouldn't it work for us? So we contacted Voicescape and we had some discussion, and following the discussion, we conducted a 6-month trial, and that trial went from November 2020 right through to April 2021. So in terms of the results and the impact of the trial, been really interesting. It took us about a 2-month lead in to get into a position where our data was ready to go and the software was working the way we wanted it to. We decided to engage with our council tax charge payers who had defaulted through the whole of the process and had got to the point where normally they would have gone to court, obviously bearing in mind that we didn't have any courts at this point in time. We started to actually contact them using the Voicescape solution in mid-January, and the pilot ran through to April the 30th. So effectively, we had a good 16 weeks of the pilot. We recorded a message. It clearly spelled out that the customer needed to engage with us before, or the case would be passed to court, and it could incur court costs. We also, for us, spelling out the consequences was really important because we didn't want people to feel as though there was any option not to engage with us. We set up a dedicated contact telephone number, which we sufficiently manned by staff trained to be able to handle Voicescape customers. And on Voicescape's advice, we started low and slow. So it was what we wanted to do is we started with only a few accounts, and we built that up over the weeks of the pilot. And we actually built it up so that it was enough to be handled by between 1 and 2 operators. We were concerned that customers might think that this was a scam, and so we ensured that the phone number that the charge payer was being called from, which was a local one, was present on our website. And when you actually put that number into search engines like Google, it actually showed Middlesbrough Council's site at the very, very top of the list when the number was Googled. So it actually showed that we were contacting our customers from this number. And that was important to us. We didn't want customers to feel as though this was something that perhaps they shouldn't engage with. This was something that was perhaps, you know, a con man trying to make a fast track from our customers' money. So all in all, over the whole of the pilot, as you'll be able to see on the slide, we contacted 2,696 of our charge payers, and of those, we found that some of our data wasn't quite up to scratch. So 667 of those contacts, that the data in there wasn't a usable phone number. So one learning thing that we've got from this is we learned our data is really, really important, and we've been making lots of efforts to actually go away and tidy up our data so that when it does go through, it goes through clean. So on the back of that, we actually had 1,209 conversations. So for us, that's 59% of the usable numbers that were passed over. They were all people that we were actually able to make contact with. Now, bearing in mind, we were getting 3.7 and 5% with our own trial, and we'd seen 69% with our partner 13 group. 59% was in the top end ballpark of what we were expecting. We were absolutely over the moon with it. So if you move on to what we actually did with those 1,209 conversations, you'll see that there's now a hierarchy of success on the slide. That really, what that shows is we wanted to measure how well we actually collected from those that we actually connected to, and what that really shows is that 200 of them paid something on the actual day of the call. That's nearly 6% paid in full. Again, that was something that we were really pleased on, and it backed up our staff saying that if you get them on the phone, we will collect from them. And then if you move on to the next slide, which is a summary, on the day of the call, we actually were able to collect £47,900. So they were basically customers who were either paying their council tax in full, or they were actually bringing their council tax up to date or making some kind of payment. What we also found, though, if we actually analysed the data for the 30 days after the call, that 47,000 actually increases to 103,000. So those who were actually saying to us, we'll make an arrangement and we'll pay on payday, or we'll pay on a certain date, or we'll set up for a direct debit, those payments were following through. And then we actually analysed the data throughout the whole of the pilot, and what we found there was that £146,000 was collected in the whole of the pilot. So if you kind of look at that, we collected £146,000 in 15 weeks, and we only actually put 3% of our council tax base through the Voicescape pilot. Now, if you work that out, you know, a high proportion of Middlesbrough council tax customers do fall into arrears at some point during the council tax year. If we were to put anywhere, if you scale that up and put anywhere in the region of, say, 50% of our council tax base through there, imagine the sort of volumes of cash that you can actually collect through the Voicescape process. That's certainly something we're going to do. We're going to look to start to scale it up and probably you know, look to include Voicescape at more points of our process, perhaps put it after the initial bill, after the first reminder, after the final notice, and then even pre-liability, so even pre-court hearing. So in terms of the Revs and Ben staff, in general, staff had previously reported the negative impact that it had on their own well-being as a result of outbound conversations with residents. They were instigating the call. They were getting lots of customers who didn't really want to be on the call, or we were interrupting a busy time, and the overall conversation was quite a negative and a difficult one. What we found with using Voicescape Bearing in mind these customers choose to come through to us, so they've actually heard the message and they've decided to actually connect with us. It actually means we can now free up staff resources who would have been outbound calling. We can reallocate them to services where human interventions add more value to further improve our overall performance. But staff working on the Voicescape line have said that it improved both staff and resident wellbeing. It improved their satisfaction with the job that they were doing, because it was significantly altering the nature of the interactions. Our staff, certainly the staff I've spoken to, prefer to man the Voicescape line rather than our normal phone line, because the customers coming through obviously have chosen to engage and are usually more likely to be wanting to pay, wanting to make an arrangement, or to do something positive about the debt. I mean, some of the things we did while we were on them was to check that the discounts were correct, check that the council tax reduction was correct. We also wanted to test how this landed from the customer perspective. So we have carried out a feedback session with customers who engage with the session, with the service, and asking 3 specific questions. So the first question was, prior to speaking to me today, you received an automated call. How clear were the instructions on the automated call? From 1 up to 5, our rating was 4.82. Second question was, on a scale of 1 to 5, how easy did the automated call make having a conversation with me today? On a scale of 1 to 5, we rated at 4.85. And the third question was, how satisfied were you with the automated call that transferred you to me? 1 to 5, 4.88 satisfaction. If you think 4.88 out of 5 for people who have to pay their council tax, really, I mean, for me, again, that rating was really, really reassuring. And I think really the final thing I would leave you with is so some customers have actually come back with some words for us about the actual product they used with using Voicescape. And the one that really lands with me is the one who said, "Thanks for contacting me in this way. I really appreciate it, as I always forget to pay my council tax and I don't want to set up a direct debit or a standing order. It doesn't work for me. Please, can you contact me this way every month as a reminder for me to pay?" So for that person, we're actually going to make sure that they're in our Voicescape file every month, or they're contacted by one of our officers. We do appreciate that we need to give our customers choices, and many of them don't want to pay by direct debit or don't want to pay by standing order. So it really, really has helped us to learn a little bit about our customers and the way they engage, and getting a 60% engagement rate and 146,000 collection rate for this pilot has been absolutely fantastic for us. And as such, we're going to be using Voicescape a lot more in the future. I think that's all for me for now. I'll hand you back over to Karen.
Sincere apologies for the technical issue that we had, but what we've decided to do is to just have the do a separate Q&A session and answer those questions that we posted. So the first question I'm going to ask Stephen. So a lot of councils are actively moving away from making calls as a part of their digital strategy. So how do voice calls fit with the wider digital strategy?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there, Karen. When we talk about phone calls, it seems to be kind of a bit of an old school technology compared to some more digital, more progressive digital approaches. So what role how do we kind of square that circle? And I mentioned in my presentation the difference between a digital strategy that is kind of digital by design and one that is digital by default. And I think that's a key differentiation really to make in this context. So the difference for me there is that if we're being digital by design, then we're using those digital channels and services in a more targeted way. We're not just taking a blanket approach to migrating as many services and interactions online as possible. And for me, that's where the behavioural science comes in and has a role to play, because we know that for some residents and for some interactions, digital channels or services are likely to result in suboptimal outcomes from a behavioural point of view. We might get a short-term efficiency gain, but often that turns into a false economy in the longer term if we end up creating failure demand through selecting the wrong channel or reducing the propensity to engage, or, as we've seen in the presentation, reducing satisfaction. And so for me, that's exactly why voice has a key role to play within a digital strategy, because it is that digital design mindset. We are using digital channels where they are appropriate and where they drive optimal outcomes, but we're also using other channels like phone and the power of voice for those interactions where those digital channels and services wouldn't be appropriate. And that fits in a digital strategy because we're using technology to optimize how efficiently we can have those voice conversations. So it does sound like a bit of a paradox there for phone calls and a digital strategy, but I think it does come together. It is a circle that is squared.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Stephen, for that. And just a question for you, Mark. What are the savings in manpower resource have you experienced in general?
It's really hard to quantify because so much happens within a normal council tax process, whereby we're already making outbound calls, or customers are making inbound calls. It's actually quite difficult to put a particular amount on it. But one thing I would say is if we were to sit a member or a couple of members of staff down and say, go away and make 2,000 calls, even if you just look at it for 5 minutes a call, I think that works out at 166 hours worth of calling. So really, you wouldn't really want a member of staff or a couple of members of staff away from your normal business for 166 hours. And bearing in mind when we actually did this on our evening shift, we were only getting a 5% success rate. So,
Right.
but really, I think what we're saying though is aside from all of that, there are lots and lots of other savings that are probably quite difficult to quantify around, around us actually making an outbound call at some point in the process, or even when we've actually contacted the customer and agreed an arrangement. At that point, there's no further need for any of the further recovery letters. So there's potential savings that are recognisable around the post that we send, and some of the other parts of the billing process that really it saves you by getting into the customer early on in the process.
And I'm just going to extend on that question as well. I've got another question. What has the reaction been from the team? And did they have any reservations about the system?
Yeah, from the team itself, from Revs and Ben's staff, I think many of us, myself included, were worried that customers wouldn't engage because they haven't engaged previously when we've tried the other methods. We definitely feel that some of the preparation that we did around the message and the consequence, and also the training we did for staff has helped us. But overall, really, the team really like the product and like to use it, and we definitely want to roll it out more in the future.
That's great. This is a question for you, Stephen. You mentioned that trust and relationship influences residents' behaviour. Can you talk a bit more about how that works?
Yeah, sure, Karen. I mean, it is a fascinating area, something that I'm personally really interested in at the moment, but I think it's something that the evidence is only really starting to get to grips with, really. So in the presentation, I mentioned the link between communication and trust and how communication is a key driver of trust. But the other component in there that I didn't mention is perceived fairness. So the extent to which a resident feels like they've been treated fairly by the council in this context, but services more generally. So fundamentally, as human beings, we're driven by a sense of fairness and justice. And some studies showed that this actually could be innate. Children as young as 3 are displaying this sense of needing to kind of redress the balance if they feel hard done by or see other people being hard done by. So if we feel treated unfairly or we see other people being treated unfairly, we seem to have this innate drive to restore that balance, to get some sort of kind of payback or justice. So that's the science bit. But then if we translate that into the context of relationships with residents, if they feel treated unfairly by the council, then we're hypothesizing that this will be reflected in their behaviours and kind of mediated by this innate desire for justice, so some sense of payback. So in very basic terms, if they feel treated unfairly, and feel treated unfairly, and perceived fairness is the key thing. We may not feel that we are treating them unfairly, but if for whatever reason they feel that, that's the key thing. But that results in them being less likely to engage, potentially less likely to pay on time, keep up repayment arrangements, supply information that we need from them on a timely basis, and a host of other compliance behaviours that ultimately require council resource to deal with. So it's that sense that the trust, relationships, and that notion of perceived fairness drives customer behaviours for various reasons that then result in increased demand.
That's great. Thanks, Stephen. And back across to yourself, Mark. I think you started touching on this on your last question. And do you have any plans to extend the use of the system within the department?
Yeah, some of my colleagues are probably, I would say, queuing up to actually have a little bit of the technology, which is all great. Although from a project management point of view, it's a whole boatload of work that I'll probably have to try and factor in. So we talked about in my presentation around what we've done for council tax. We actually want to use it for lots of different stages of the council tax process. We didn't really touch in that we also did a little mini trial on housing benefit overpayment collection, and that was similarly successful. We would want to extend it out within that service. And we'd also done a little bit of work on a very small pilot around chasing up people for where they'd put in a claim for council tax reduction. They'd said they were going to provide us with further information, and we were actually using Voicescape to call them, to remind them of the letter that we previously sent, try to get the information over the phone and actually get them a bill that day so that we could then say, right, are we going to get a payment? Are we going to get an arrangement? But beyond that, there's things like collection of business rates, there's accounts receivable, we have car parking fines, and that's really just to name the first few who I've spoken to within the service who said, we could make use of that. Wider in the council engages with customers every day for hundreds of reasons, and it's an engagement tool. So there are so many other uses, and I think really we're only just scratching the surface with what we're doing at Middlesbrough. And in fact, we've got a meeting fairly soon where we're actually going to start to explore how it might work for perhaps getting in touch with adult social care customers, or getting in touch for just feedback about service, or whatever else you really. It's sort of like there's no limit really, I think, to what we can use this software for. And
I know in the presentation you gave some feedback around customer feedback. Did the customers have to be reassured about it was Middlesbrough that was actually calling you? What sort of things did you put in place so they knew it wasn't a scam?
So usually the call linked to something having already happened. So a bill had gone out, a reminder had gone out, a final notice. So if you like, from the timing of it, it linked to something that was relatively fresh in the customer's mind. But then the second thing really, it was coming from a local number. So in Teesside, our STD code is 01642. The number that the customer saw was an 01642 number. So that was a second piece, if you like. Thirdly, is that some customers, when we spoke to them, we were obviously saying, were you comfortable with this? And they said what they'd done is they'd actually hung up on the call, but they'd Googled the number to tell me who's rung me. And on the advice of some of your Voicescape colleagues, we actually put on our website, our council tax collections website, the number in all the different forms, with a space, without a space, with brackets. And what happened then is Google brings Middlesbrough Council's council tax collection page top of the search. So those customers were really, really nervous. They were obviously able to see that. And then there was a few who were a little bit cautious about ringing the line. And in fact, what they did is they came through on our other line. So they came through and said, I've been contacted by somebody saying they're from Middlesbrough Council. Was it you? Well, once we saw the number, yes, it was. We then able to put them through the Voicescape line, and they were able to then deal with the operator about their arrears. So overall, it kind of all rolled up. It was a number of things that kind of rolled together as one. But I think the really good thing is, apart from the good feedback, we didn't get any complaints at all out of the 2,000 contacts that we made. So, and I monitored the complaints, so I can tell you firsthand that we didn't have anything.
Thank you for that. I think this is the last question for you, Stephen. More and more councils are starting to use behavioural insights. So what do you think they can be best used to help Revs and Ben's team?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We are seeing behavioural insights being used more and more within a council context. The behavioural insights team have done a lot of good work around that, and the LGA specifically, they've done a lot of good work to kind of raise awareness and build capability, capacity around the application of behavioural insights. I think the key thing is, in Revs and Bens, but more generally, is that the majority of that work has been done around kind of nudge-based principles. So how we can use nudge-style interventions, so small tweaks to letters and small tweaks to other sorts of service nodes to drive behaviours. And that's fine, that's an important part of how we can have an impact. But I think going forward, it needs to kind of expand out from that focus on nudge to look at how behavioural insights can be applied more generally, because it's a much kind of broader toolbox, so to speak, than just nudge techniques. So within our own work, for instance, we use a lot of behavioural segmentation work. This for us is kind of data science, but it's part of that behavioural insights approach. So understanding which groups of people within the population are more likely to miss a payment, you know, adopt a certain payment behaviour, represent different sorts of risk related to payment behaviours and arrears, etc. So there's that element that I think would add further value. And that then also speaks to the propensity to pay question, which I know a lot of Revs and Bens teams are you know, working hard to get to grips with. Where do we focus the resource? If we had a sense, kind of an evidence-based sense of which customers are more likely to pay, then, you know, some would argue that's where the resource needs to go, because there's some low-hanging fruit there. And again, for me, that's all part of the behavioural approach, understanding which behaviours are more likely to kind of be manifest. I think one extra element just in there as well is, again, as part of our own work, there's that behavioural science element, there's that kind of data science piece, but there's also that important element of kind of understanding what's going on in the lives of our residents, you know, asking that why question. Why are people struggling to pay? Why are they not engaging? Why are they struggling to maintain that repayment arrangement? So backing all that science, that kind of quantitative science, up with some qualitative research to get a real understanding of what's driving resident behaviours, and then feeding that back into service design and potentially into the training of staff and how they deal with their interactions. So I think the nudge work has been brilliant, and there's a lot of learning to take away from that, but I think it's just scratching the surface as far as the impact that behavioural insights could potentially have on Revs and Bens performance.
Excellent, great, thank you. And I think this is the last question for yourself, Mark, and it's around compliance. And what did your compliance team have any reservations or any concerns around the system around GDPR?
So yeah, we had to do a data protection impact assessment. We had to involve our data protection officer. We absolutely would not want to be passing any personal details over to Voicescape that would be able to identify a specific customer. And so I think the beauty of this is, when we were talking to you about the format of any file that we uploaded, we actually only uploading two things. We're only uploading a council tax account number and a telephone number. Nothing to say that belongs to anyone in particular. And I think the beauty of the technology, when it works in conjunction with our telephony system, is when that customer then comes through to the telephone line, the operator gets a whisper in their ear, which tells them that council tax account number. And that's the point that we marry the customer that's on the phone with the detail that we just got in our ear to pull their details up on our account. So if anyone were to have intercepted the file upload, and I know it's a secure transfer, so the chances are it's not likely, but if that was to have happened, or if Voicescape, you know, had staff who were able to see our file, there's nothing on that file that actually identifies a specific customer at that stage. So it works really, really well for us, and that's the way that certainly we'll continue to upload our data in the future.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you very much both for doing the Q&A as a separate session, and thank you very much for all of you for joining, and sincere apologies for the technical hitch that we had at the end. And as I said previously, both Mark and myself would be more than happy to have an offline conversation with you. Thanks very much.